Welcome to Shelby Podcast, a production of Shelby Systems Media. And now here's your host, Don Alsop.
Dan Busby is president of ECFA, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. Mr. Busby founded a CPA firm, was the controller of a major medical center, and CFO of a major religious denomination. Dan, I really enjoyed meeting you last year at the conference. You did such a great job, they've invited you back again this year to speak.
Yes, and I really appreciate being invited back to the Shelby Conference. I really enjoyed speaking in a number of the venues at the conference last year. The folks that attend the Shelby Conference are so dedicated and committed to the work of churches and ministries. Just a thrill to serve them, and I'm looking forward to being back with you in San Antonio this year.
As everyone knows, there are lots of changes taking place in Washington right now, Dan. I know you're teaching a class called Capitol Hill Issues that may affect your church. Could you possibly give us a really quick synopsis of the most important new legislation for 2011 that churches and nonprofits should be aware of?
While we haven't had very much legislation that impacts churches and ministries, there is probably more in the wind on Capitol Hill than in recent years. I'll just give you a couple quick examples. Senator Grassley closed his investigation of 6 churches in January of 2011, but he turned over to my organization, ECFA, 61 pages of questions and issues that he would like a response about concerning issues for churches. These include issues relating to the housing allowance, churches filing the Form 990, political electioneering from the pulpit, and much more. And so there are a host of issues that are on the table in 2011 that attendees of the conference will want to be informed about.
Another class you'll be leading is titled Limit the Fraud Risks at Your Organization. Are you finding that fraud is increasing in churches and charities, and what kind of advice will you be giving to assist ministries in dealing with fraud issues?
It seems like there are increasing reports of fraud in churches and ministries, and so this class will focus in on those issues and will include things like having a proper perspective on fraud. I would suggest that churches and ministries can't eliminate all fraud, but they can certainly minimize it, and talking about some of the greatest asset protection risks with some of the electronic transactions that we're using more frequently in churches and ministries. We'll be focusing on some of these newer transactions where we may have more significant risks than what a lot of people think.
And I think you're also teaching another class named Financial Issues for Church-Sponsored Short-Term Mission Trips. What topics do you plan to cover in that class?
Well, one of the things we'll start right out with is talking about proper oversight and what that oversight really looks like, and then we'll move on and talk about proper communication between the church and the short-term trip participants and the givers who are interested in supporting these trips. Finally, we'll talk about some record-keeping issues and how to appropriately record and document and report the use of the funds related to these trips. This is such an important topic, and many times some of these issues are not handled exactly right.
So what days and times will you be leading these sessions, and will you be giving away any materials or books like you did last year?
Well, it looks like Wednesday's my day at the conference. On Wednesday, June 15, I'll be teaching the short-term mission trip workshop at 10 a.m., and then the limiting the fraud risks of your organization at 12:45 p.m., and then finally the Capitol Hill issues that may affect your church at 4 p.m. And I hope to have a supply of the Church and Nonprofit Tax Financial Guide that is published by Zondervan to distribute on a complimentary basis to the attendees.
Well, last year the economy was in really rough shape, and I remember that you told us that focusing on ministry margin was very important at that time. What would your top financial advice be for churches and nonprofits for today in 2011?
Well, one of the things that I think churches and ministries need to focus on today is what I call modeling integrity. You know, whether a church or ministry is an ECFA member or not and following our standards, churches and ministries should set a high example of accountability and transparency with respect to handling God's resources. And so I believe this is the time for us to model integrity.
You know, I was doing some research a while back, and I ran across your blog, danbusby.com. I read several of your stories, and the one I enjoyed the most, I think, was titled Perspective. Would you mind giving us maybe the Reader's Digest version of that story that you wrote a couple of years ago?
Well, in that blog, I was talking about our grandson, Daniel, 9 years old now, but when he was diagnosed with autism at age 4, the dreams of his parents, our daughter and our son-in-law, seemed to vanish. And I told the story about how he was challenged by some of the Little League baseball activities, but he went from not sharing the ball to fielding the balls and running over to first base to hand the ball to Bob, who played first base, and Bob's disabilities prevented him from catching a thrown ball. And Daniel, our grandson, he became great teammates. And so the point I was making was that God has the unfailing power to bring good from all circumstances that come our way. What we seem as good often depends on our perspective. God is just as much the God of our challenges as he is the God of our successes.
Well, Dan, we're really looking forward to seeing you and hearing from you again this year at the International Shelby Conference in San Antonio. We're on pace, actually, to set a record number of attendees this summer, and I believe everyone is going to love your classes. They're going to love the speakers, the venue, and, of course, the river walk. Dan, I think we just about covered everything. Is there anything else you can think of to tell our listeners before we close today?
Well, I was just thinking about a few lines I read in Ruth Haley Barton's marvelous little book, Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership, where she talks about the importance of spiritual leadership, and I think that is so important, spiritual leadership and spiritual discernment for church leaders and ministry leaders. She refers to the capacity to recognize and respond to the presence and the activity of God. Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you may discover what the will of God is. And I think that is our key challenge as leaders today, is simply to discover God's will and be in the center of his will.
Ministry finance expert and president of the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, Dan Busby, will be teaching 3 incredibly valuable classes at this year's International Shelby Conference in San Antonio, Texas. Make sure that you sign up for his finance session scheduled for Wednesday, June the 15th. Visit shelbyinc.com/ISC for all the details. And don't miss our next video podcast featuring ISC keynote speaker and Grammy Award winner Nicole C. Mullen. Before we go, here is our inspirational quote for the day, and it comes from Matthew 6:21. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will be also.
You've been listening to Shelby Podcast with your host, Don Alsop. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time for another Shelby Podcast.